Hey, Matt Schaff of DraftSharks.com here, specifically to talk to anyone brand new to fantasy football. If you're wondering what is fantasy football, well, that's just what I'm looking to answer in this short video. If you're an experienced fantasy player, then please feel free to check out another of our fantasy football advice videos on the DraftSharks YouTube channel. Now, let's start with the basics. What is fantasy football? It's a fun game. It actually started long ago in a bar among guys who were big football fans, talked football all the time, and wanted to find a way to compete with each other on their football knowledge. In fantasy football, what you do is build a virtual team of actual NFL players to compete against other such teams within your league. Try to beat your friends, your coworkers, whoever you're playing against. Most fantasy football leagues begin with a draft, where in some fashion you select that group of players to compete against the rest of your league. There are two primary formats to fantasy football drafting. One is a snake draft, where each team in your league takes turns selecting a player. When it gets to the end of the round, it then flips the order and the next round goes the same way, just in the opposite order. The point of that is to foster fairness for everyone. So no team is choosing the first player in every round, and no team is stuck with the last player available in every round. Another primary format of drafting is an auction. That's when you don't take turns picking players, but it works just like a real life auction does. One player at a time is put up for bid. The whole league puts in bids until one winning bid gets that player, and you repeat that process until the entire league has a full roster of players. Once your league, which is typically made up of 10 to 12 teams, but could be fewer, could be as few as 8 or even 6, could be as many as 14, 16. I've even encountered a 32 team league, which you have to be pretty dedicated to keep up with. But once you have your league set with however many teams are in it, you need to manage your roster throughout the season. In most cases, that includes setting a weekly lineup, filling whatever your starting roster spots are for a given week with players that will compete against your opponent for that week. There are some formats that go with total points instead, which is counting up how many points each team scores that week and then creating standings off of those points rather than having head to head. But you'll most commonly find a head to head format where your team is facing another team in your league and win-loss record is tracked throughout the season. As you're managing your team throughout the year, you will deal with injuries, you will deal with players that disappoint versus how you expected them to perform heading into the season. A couple of key ways we use to manage that roster to try to improve our players as we go are the waiver wire and trades. The waiver wire is any players that don't get drafted or who get released from teams during the season go into this pool. And generally, each week you have a chance to bid on those free agent players to try to pick them up. Not all leagues use this bidding process. Some just go first come, first serve. Some have bidding and then a first come, first serve. There are varieties of formats there, but the main point is to pick up free agents as you go to try to enhance your roster, to try to fill gaps, to try to fill in bye week. If, say, your quarterback is off that week and suddenly you need somebody else to start. Trades can be the most fun part of fantasy, can also be frustrating depending on who you play with in your league. But trades are basically what you're probably familiar with in real sports, where one team sends assets to another team. Let's hope that they agree in a way that helps both sides. Unless you're playing against buddies and you really want to screw somebody over, then you can try to get the best of them in any trade. Trades are a great way to enhance your roster throughout the season, to build up what's been a weakness. And at DraftSharks.com, we have tools specifically designed to help with both free agent pickups and trades throughout the season. The free agent finder will sync directly with your league to show you who you can pick from to add to your team. And the trade analyzer is able to look at the entirety of a league that you have synced with DraftSharks.com to show you who might be your optimal trade partners. Of course, we're competing against other teams, and that means we need some sort of a scoring system. Now, how does scoring work in fantasy football? Points are awarded for different player categories, different player actions, such as yards gained, whether receiving, rushing, or passing. Touchdowns, again, receiving, rushing, passing. Receptions. Defenses score on sacks, on turnover plays, by how many points they allow to the opposing offenses. Field goals and extra points, of course, count for kicker scoring if you use kickers in your league. And you can even play with individual defensive players who then, of course, score points across their individual categories, such as tackles, sacks, interceptions, passes defense. You can get much more into that if you decide to play IDP. And we have a separate video that dives into how to play with individual defensive players. There are varying scoring formats in fantasy. The top level decision of your scoring format tends to be how much you give to receptions. You might hear standard or non PPR. You might hear people talk about PPR, which stands for point per reception. And then you might hear about half PPR, which has grown some in popularity in recent years. That, of course, is when a reception is worth half a point. So PPR generally means each reception counts as 1 point within that scoring format. You can certainly vary that however you want, but deciding how much receptions are worth, whether it's 1, whether it's 0, or whether it's any other number, is going to be a key differentiator into how you should value positions and specific players within your league. Of course, the other part of how you score a fantasy football league is exactly what positions you're starting every week. You're going to want at least one quarterback. You're probably going to want 2 running backs in most cases. Leagues commonly start 2 to 3 wide receivers. There's generally a tight end. You can have a defense and or a kicker, or neither if you would like. And there's often a flex spot, and flex refers to a position that can be a wide receiver, can be a running back, can be a tight end. That's most commonly what a flex is. It could also be any 2 of those positions, or you could even play in a league with a super flex where that extra player can be a quarterback. That adds value to the quarterback for leagues that think that a single quarterback starting doesn't give enough value to the position that the NFL deems the most important. Lots of room for variation to fit how you want to play. Now, if you're enjoying this video so far, if you want to learn even more about fantasy football, please subscribe to the Draft Sharks YouTube channel. We're certainly not just here to teach. We also want to help you win across fantasy football formats with advice throughout the year. That includes multiple videos every week from July through the end of the regular season. And as we'll get to in this next section here, there are lots of different formats that we're covering that you might want to play or that folks you know are playing. So we try to cover it all on the Draft Sharks YouTube channel. Next up is the types of fantasy football leagues. Redraft is the most common, and that refers to a league that just refreshes every year. You play this year ends, you're done, you start over again next year. Even if it's the same group of people that you're playing with, you're all drafting fresh teams. A dynasty league carries over your roster from year to year. So you're not only trying to win this season, but also managing a long-term roster. It's a little bit closer to being in charge of an actual sports team, if that's the kind of experience you're looking for. If you want something in between, if dynasty is too much of a commitment and redraft is not quite enough, then there are keeper leagues where you can keep several players. It could be anywhere from 1 player to 8 or whatever specific number works for your group. But keeper leagues let you hang on to some players from year to year without rolling over your entire roster. If you don't want to let that one guy who had an awesome draft, rule your league again next season, if you want some level of restart, then keeper leagues could be for you. Best ball leagues have grown in popularity recently. The key difference there is that you're simply drafting a team and then you don't have to set your lineup throughout the season. Best ball refers to the system automatically playing your best lineup for that week from the players that are on your roster. So if you have 2 quarterbacks and 5 running backs and 7 wide receivers, for example, but you only start 1 QB, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers each week, the system will take the best scores from those players you have collected, automatically combine them into that week's lineup and give you that score. This can be great if you want to draft, if you want to compete, but if the week-to-week management is a little bit too much of a time commitment for you. Great way to get around that. And like I said, it's gained popularity in recent years with sites such as Underdog Fantasy. DFS, the last format I'll talk about here, that stands for Daily Fantasy Sports. That's those commercials from FanDuel and DraftKings that slap you in the face when you're watching football over the weekend. Very short term, a wide range of entry levels in terms of what you pay. This is a pay to play format. So if that's what you're looking for, DFS is a good format for you. And the good thing about it is that it's short term. If you have a bad Sunday, you have a whole new set of rosters the next week. You're not hanging on to any of these players from one week to the next. Now, whatever format you play, the key to fantasy, the reason people play it is strategy. I mean, there's no reason to play fantasy football unless you want to try to out strategize your opponents. Of course, the key here is to know your format, because you're not going to build the right strategy or find the right strategy if you're not familiar with what your specific format is. And, I've gotten into it a little bit, but there are lots of variations. Even tiny variations can make a difference in terms of how you should play a league and what's going to win. Whatever format you're playing, you're generally trying to balance risk versus reward. You don't want to get all the safest players. You don't want to get all of the riskiest players, but you do generally want to shoot for upside, guys that can score a lot more than what you're expecting from where you draft them at the beginning of the season. That is one of the biggest keys to winning in fantasy, no matter what format you're trying to play, is chasing upside. That's something we focus on at draftsharks.com, something we build into our fantasy tools. You're also going to need to navigate bye weeks and injuries, like I talked about. That's where your waiver wire process comes in. That's where those free agents come in. That's looking ahead. That's where you can get ahead of your league mates if you know a bye week's coming and you get that player before you're going to need him, in case somebody else in your league also needs somebody that week. They get to the waiver wire and find that guy is already gone. And of course, flexibility is important in pretty much any fantasy football format. Things are never going to go exactly the way you expect them to in the draft. Players are not going to perform exactly the way you expect them to during the season. So you need to be able to move on the fly, or you need to have a good draft assistant or league management assistant that can help you instill that flexibility in your strategy and in your team. If you're here because you're about to play in a fantasy league for the first time, then I hope I have helped you a little bit to make you a little bit more comfy about jumping in. If you're not in a league yet, consider gathering a group of your friends, coworkers, whatever, to start your own. There are also places out there where you can just jump into a league. You don't have to know the people that you're playing with. You can check out our review of the best fantasy football websites for recommendations of where to play, maybe to match the format that you might be looking for. And of course, we've got a wealth of fantasy football advice articles and powerful tools to help you win across formats. Even if you're just looking for some free advice, you can head to draftsharks.com. You can find plenty of articles addressing different areas of fantasy and different formats that you might encounter. Even if you're not sure whether you need a site like DraftSharks, if you're considering making that move up to a site that you have to pay for to get some advice, to get some help as you draft, as you manage a team, now's a great time to just take a test drive on draftsharks.com, because you can get our draft package for less than $10. Just head to draftsharks.com/subscribe for more information. And thanks for checking out this video.